The federal Liberal government made big promises. Stakeholders and citizens put forth savvy requests. But now that the budget has come down, it's left many people, well, underwhelmed. What shaped the government's choices this budget cycle, and what were the best choices they could have made? Let's ask. In the nation's capital, Angela McEwen, senior economist at the Canadian Labour Congress and fellow at the Broadbent Institute. And here in studio, John Duffy, a principal at Strategy Corp, and Sean Speer, senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And we'd like to welcome John, you back for the first time in a long time to
nice
these
to
parts.
see you.
Sean, first time ever on our program. We're glad to have you here. And Angela, welcome back as well to you in the nation's capital. Let's give Andrew Coyne from the National Post the first word on this. This was in his column a couple of days ago, and then we'll chat. But of course, it isn't just that they've run out of money, they've run out of ideas, or at least good ideas. What they have are a lot of meaningless buzzwords. I have read a good many tedious, empty budgets in my time. I cannot recall ever reading one quite as mind-bendingly empty as this one. Innovation, strategic, whole of government, world-class, value chain, smart cities, centers of excellence. The budget burbles happily on for page after page in this vein. One has the strong sense its authors have no more idea of what any of it means than they do, quote, middle class. Much is promised but put off until the future. I lost track of the number of plans that will be proposed or policies that will be developed at some later date. First thing we've got to find out is whether or not you agree with Brother Coyne. Angela, come on in. What do you say?
Well, I think he's being a little bit harsh. So when I was reading the budget, I myself went between cynicism and optimism. But I think if we look at the big picture, there was an ambitious proposal last year. They're carrying through on that proposal, so I don't know why we would have expected a whole bunch of new ideas this budget. It's more of a status quo carrying on through. And certainly there's a lot of details yet to come. Andrew's absolutely on the money there. But doing stuff right takes time.
Understood. Sean?
There's much to like in the budget. Changes to the caregiver tax credit, reforms to parental benefit, and several others that I think are steps in the right direction. But what strikes me is that the second budget of this government, the second year of its majority mandate, what has typically been the peak of policymaking ambition, and instead, government's taken a pass, a cautiousness, a pragmatism that I hadn't anticipated. And I wonder if many of its progressive voters would have anticipated.
John?
I just don't see it that way. I'm much more in Angela's camp. I think this is a continuity, but it's not a continuity with the status quo. It only looks status quo when you compare it to last year. Last year was revolutionary. Last year was a massive overhaul of Canadian federal public policy after a decade of federal public policy under the Harper government, the government that Sean was part of, going in a really different direction. So sure, it's a continuation, but of something that is itself a really significant repositioning of how the country operates.
What's that a reference to?
Well, it shows up in many areas. One of the most important is certainly the new emphasis on social policy. The Harper government preferred social policies that I think were usually in the form of micro designer tax credits, things like for hockey equipment and stuff like that. The Canada Child Benefit is a massive social policy change. Morneau led off his speech talking about the effects of that. And, a cynic could say, oh, he's recycling last year's announcement. Yeah, sure. But the point really needed to be made. What a difference this is actually making in people's lives. The housing money that had been talked about and has now come across is going to bring back to life in this country a social housing sector that has been essentially dormant for almost 20 years. Angela's right. Things take time in Ottawa, and they're on time and they're on course. I think this is a continuation of a really serious transformation. Couldn't be further from a status quo. It's tunnel vision to think of it that way.
Angela, you got referenced a couple of times in that answer, so let's go back to you. You mentioned you were sort of somewhere between cynicism and optimism. Closer to one than the other as a result of having heard the budget?
No, not really. So maybe in different areas. So on housing, I think they did a fantastic job. Again, though, this is almost like setting themselves up for a re-election budget. A lot of people have commented on that as well, where funding doesn't roll out until next year or the year after. So, right before the election, that's when the next year's budget, that's when the money and the details really start to flow. But childcare, it's great to see 10-year commitment, multi-year commitment to childcare. It's great to see them working on a framework with the provinces and having a distinct framework with Indigenous peoples. But it's a fraction of the need. So it said that it could possibly pay for 40,000 childcare spaces if that's all it was dedicated to. But the need, we only have 1 in 4 kids under 5 have a childcare space, and the OECD average is half. So we need to double our childcare spaces, which means we need 500,000 new spaces, and we need to make the ones we have more affordable. So it's a third of Paul Martin's promise in 2005. It's far less than the NDP promised in the last year's election. So this is where I'm stuck between, I'm glad we're working. It's a good first step. We're on the path. But we're nowhere near where we need to be.
Okay, Sean, let me get you to follow up on another angle that John referenced in his answer there, which is the notion that this is sort of a continuation of quite revolutionary change that the Liberals brought in during their first budget a year ago. What's your take on that?
I would say 2 things. First of all, with regards to that particular point, I think it overstates how so-called revolutionary last year's budget was. The Canada Child Benefit, which John mentions, for instance, is built on a foundation that was started by Mr. Martin, expanded by Mr. Harper, and incrementally changed by the current government. It's not to say it's not a good policy, but hardly revolutionary. Over the past year, since last budget, the government is committed to conduct a review of rationalizing the tax code, revamping science policy, revamping transportation policy, and in recent weeks, speculation that they would privatize airports. In all 4 instances, the budget is virtually silent. So they've chosen to take a path on these major policy reforms, the type of thing you would think you would undertake in the second year of majority mandate.
I'm not sure it's fair to say they've taken a pass on it. They haven't made a decision on it yet. And in fact, Mr. Morneau has sort of admonished everybody not to speculate too much on what tax measures may still be to come. They weren't in this budget. Now, having said that, those are 4 areas that have been identified, and there have been trial balloons floating all over the place on it, and the budget didn't do anything on those. Missed opportunity?
No, I don't think so. I mean, look, we've seen a pattern from time to time in governments where the second budget is the real budget, right? The first one is sort of one that you say, oh God, we're new here, cripes, what are we going to pull off the shelf? Let's just recycle the platform. We thought it through to a certain degree, so let's just go with that. And then we'll really figure out what we're doing in budget 2. To an unusual degree, and people don't give them credit for this, but they should, the third party, Trudeau Liberals, actually thought through pretty carefully what they wanted to do while they were sitting there with everyone laughing at them and saying, you're all doomed and you're never going to win this election. So they were able to roll into the budget, the first Morneau budget, pretty much what they talked about on the campaign trail, and make it a 5-year framework for governing.
Well, with one significant difference, and we'll get into that now, and that is during the campaign, we were promised $10 billion annual deficits in order to sort of gently kickstart the economy. Sean, we are seeing deficits now close to $30 billion annually. I don't want to say as far as the eye can see, but certainly for a long way. How worried are you about that?
I'm surprised that Mr. Morneau didn't take the opportunity to provide a clear path to balance. Leaving that issue unresolved, I think, will put some pressure on the economy. It will have impact on confidence, particularly the extent to which tax hikes are dangling as a threat in the future. But more fundamentally, over the past year, they've conducted reviews. This is the government of consultation, and it begs the question, when are we going to see action stemming from those consultations? And you would have thought that this budget would have been an opportunity to advance reform. And as we get closer to the next election, it's typical for the government to be more cautious and careful. And so if you're cautious and careful now, what's the likelihood that we will see big action in subsequent years?
Hang on, John. I want to go to Angela first. I see you champing at the bit to get in, but let me get Angela on this. Angela, I know money's cheap right now, but I've also seen comments that we're actually closer to the next recession than from the last recession, and that if deficits don't get under control, we could be asking for a whole case of hurt in the future. Where are you on the fact that progress on the deficit appears not to be in this budget?
I couldn't care less. I think the International Monetary Fund global thinkers right now have said austerity doesn't work. Restricting government spending because we're afraid of deficits is a bad idea. And Canada's deficit is already low compared to other comparable nations. They have the fiscal anchor. They decided to stick with that fiscal anchor of debt to GDP. And they're saying, like, look, we have confidence that the economy will grow, that we're spending in the right places, that we're doing the right things, and that this is how we'll come out of it. Very similar to Alberta's Rachel Notley's perspective on this, is that we need to keep funding the social safety net, we need to keep funding education, we need to keep funding those core things that will get us through the recession in better shape.
John, having said that, I do want to hear from you on how concerned you are, either in terms of the finances or in terms of the politics, about the fact that $10 billion deficits were promised. What's actually been delivered are 3 times that big.
Yeah, I'm not crazy about the shifts that have to happen, but they do have to happen. I think if you look at this the way that most Canadians look at it, they think the country's being pretty well managed in the circumstances. Also, you look at the international critics who, tend to be pretty rough on Canada. But when everyone from the IMF to the Financial Times of London are saying Canada's on the right track with its fiscal and economic policies, when The Economist basically said Canada was the runner-up for Country of the Year last year, the overall mix is about right.
Who did we lose to? I can't remember.
We lost to, I think, Colombia for trying to really overcome its tortured past with the FARC negotiations.
Fair enough.
But it was a really nice pat on the head for a country that has often been regarded as, particularly by conservatives, as a bit of a dodgy economic proposition. So I think, critics don't put money in the genes of Canadian families. But the successes are there at that level, and they're showing up in the overall regard for Canada on the international scene. So I think the government's getting the whole mix of things that matter to Canadians as well as to our perception of ourselves just about right.
I think we all like Paul Wells around this literal and figurative table here. And Paul, a few years ago, wrote a very good book called The Longer I'm Prime Minister. And it was about your former boss, Stephen Harper. Let's do a quote from the book. "It is in the nature of Harper's project that he would have less to show for his time in office than some of his predecessors. They saw themselves as builders. He is a skeptic and, to use the gentlest available word, an editor. He has always wanted a federal government that meddled less in healthcare, less in executive federalism, less in municipal affairs, and to some extent less in the world than Liberals have done. He cut taxes so his government and any that succeeded his could not be tempted by ambition." I want to, okay, Sean, to you first on this one. How much of what you saw in this budget here attempts to repudiate whatever it was that Stephen Harper did in the past?
Not much. I really do believe that one of Canada's strengths, one of the reasons that we have this international reputation is because of the political consensus in Canada on a whole range of issues, childcare being just one of them, infrastructure being another. The Trudeau government has increased incremental funding for infrastructure, but it's largely rooted in the foundation that was established by the previous government.
How about the transit, the end of the tax credit for taking public transit? They got rid of that.
That's small ball, especially when all of these other tax expenditures remain. Another example of the government, as I said earlier, of the government missing this opportunity to rationalize the tax code. Like they set out in their platform in last year's budget.
I thought you'd cream them on that. I thought you'd say, how can they take a tax credit away from people who are, riding the rails? So don't we want to encourage this?
I'm in favor of a rationalized tax code, and so the government, the Liberal Party in its 2015 budget committed to identifying $3 billion in savings in new revenue from rationalizing tax code. Instead, we got $277 million.
John?
I think one of the biggest, this is a funny conversation, just stressing the continuities between Harper government and Trudeau government. That's a bit counterintuitive. I think the biggest place, though, that I can point to for the discontinuity and the change and how revolutionary I think the situation is, and positively so, comes in something that's not in the budget, and that is the historic concord that's been developed across the country in the Federation, which I summarize as being climate change for pipelines, okay? By putting together that equation that says the federal government is going to support a pipeline project to get Canada's oil sands product out to world markets in exchange, in effect, for provinces coming along on a national carbon pricing strategy. That is historic. These are the sorts of issues that used to wreck this country when you and I were in university. Okay, these were like energy wars of the early 80s that fed into unity wars and separatism dynamics. These have been deftly handled, and as a result, you now have in place a position for Canada that allows its oil to be digested ethically by people who are concerned about environmental issues, and that allows carbon pricing to be adopted by oil-producing provinces. That is really big stuff, and Harper couldn't deliver either end of that deal.
Well, two things. I'm not being a smartass here, honest to goodness, but I didn't see that concord in the health negotiations. It was the Harper strategy during the health negotiations, so that's thing one. And thing two, we're getting away from my original question, which was the issue of the public transit tax credit that will no longer be. And you know,
when Sean calls it small ball, I guess it's not a huge issue.
Well, I don't know, because I've already seen some commentary which suggests the Trudeau government is supposed to be all about ennobling the middle class and helping the middle class and those who are trying to get into it. And, you know, one would have thought that, I know you don't like the boutique tax credits that the Harper government brought in, but I've heard some complaints already this morning from people who say, hey, we're supposed to be encouraged to take public transit, and this is kind of a shot across our bow here.
Can I break in?
Go ahead.
They're investing in public transit, and that's a very social democratic thing to do. Rather than giving somebody a little bit of money back after they've already been able to buy the pass up front, we're taking that money and we're investing it in transit to make transit better, faster, cheaper.
So you're not troubled by the loss of the tax credit?
I'm not. I know that some of my friends in Toronto will be. I understand that.
That sounds like a shot against some snooty people in Toronto, Angela.
It's not. No, I mean, transit's a reality in Toronto. It's a mess, and this is a problem for Toronto. I get that. It's but in terms of how you decide how to spend money, you spend it on making good public services available to everybody, not giving the people who could afford it in the first place a little bit of money back on their taxes.
Okay, but you're an economist, so tell me this. What's your view on the so-called boutique tax credits that the Harper government brought in for transit passes, for hockey equipment, or putting your kids in athletic programs, that kind of thing? Will you be disappointed if those disappear?
Well, I think most of those have disappeared. The hockey one, I think, went away, and I thought those were awful. I had a really hard time claiming those credits, but my husband insisted that we do it because I think that benefits wealthy families that can already afford to spend lots of money to put their kids in camps and hockey and all of that, and it doesn't put money into making public recreation affordable for all families.
I think that's, Angela's really onto something about, I think the uptake levels on some of these were really quite low. Okay, because they were difficult to do. I mean, you had to save your Metro passes, and sometimes you had to save things like receipts. It's hard to do if you don't have a professional tax preparer. So it did tend to migrate up to the wealthy. I'll tell you the best place that I've seen the impact of the changes in federal public policy, and I'll grant Sean that there's some degree of a climb through different administrations on this. But it's on. I keep going back to the Canada Child Benefit. I was talking to one member of Parliament on budget night, James Maloney from Etobicoke Lakeshore. He's got the headquarters.
Liberal.
Yeah, he's got the headquarters of the Daily Bread Food Bank for Ontario in his riding in Etobicoke, South Etobicoke. And he said he went down there in September and was talking about what's going on. They said, we've had a dramatic fall off. And he said, what happened? They said, it happened in July after the new credit kicked in. Now, those are for families who are trying to get into the middle class. Those are Daily Bread Food Bank users. But that's material, that shows up. The middle class tax credit or tax cut is material and shows up. So I think those things are making a positive difference. I don't want to overclaim, but this is part of sort of the evolution of things happening here in a good and steady way.
I could not help but hear somebody out of the nation's capital refute what you just said. So Angela first, then Sean.
Okay, the middle class tax cut, if you're making the median income of around $50,000 a year, you get $0. If you're making $100,000 or $150,000 a year, you get the max benefit. So the middle class tax cut defined the middle class for us, and that's, if you're making $100,000 a year. So people in food banks are not middle class. So the middle class tax cut is like my least favorite thing that the Liberal government has done, and the Canada Child Benefit is probably my favorite thing. If we get a national childcare program, there you go.
But I think John's comments precisely make my point about the government's lack of ambition. The Canada Child Benefit and the middle class tax cut are laudatory, and I've said as much. But they're hardly revolutionary. One is built on a foundation that's been established by previous governments, and the other reduces a marginal tax rate from 22 to 20.5%. Both good policies, but hardly revolutionary. And the Prime Minister, of course, was to be the heir of progressivism when Mr. Obama stepped down. And I think I can't speak as a progressive, but it seems to me for progressive activists, for progressive voters who thought they were going to get real change, as the Prime Minister talked about in the last election campaign, I'm just surprised that they took a pass. And it has to lower expectations that we're going to see ongoing ambition in a third or fourth year leading up to the next election.
John?
I'm not sure of that. And there is the international element to consider here.
Meaning?
Meaning Trump and the administration, its volatility and unpredictability. I think certainly whatever you want to say about Trudeau government's progressive credentials by the yardsticks of Canadian public policy, there's no question that as the world is lurching, many jurisdictions are lurching towards a kind of national populism that scares the heck out of me. The genuine progressiveness of the Trudeau government becomes all the clearer every day. And how that relates to previous governments, we can argue about, but it is a global beacon of progressive, enlightened, liberal governance. I think that's a real positive. As for the boldness of it, you do, and a lot of ink has been spilled on this by some pretty smarter commentators than me who said, listen, you don't want to make a big policy move when the cards haven't come down in Washington yet. We don't really know. I mean, we're seeing a day-to-day, hour-to-hour drama as we view this show tonight in Washington as to whether the guy can even get the Obamacare dismantling legislation off Capitol Hill, whether the president can. His economic policy package hasn't even come to the fore yet. We do not know what the rogue elephant next to us is about to do next. So the time to be bold might be once we know what the elephant is going to do rather than something that might cause the elephant to do something.
Okay, with just a few minutes left here, let's put one more issue on the table. This is the last budget. A little bit of politics here. This is the last budget that the Liberals will bring in with no permanent leaders on the other side of the floor. And Sean, you're going to have a new Conservative Party leader in May. There will be a new Democratic Party leader in October. So whatever happens next year, it's going to be the A-team on the other side, as opposed to, not suggesting these folks aren't good, but clearly they are the interim leaders on the other side. Does any of that matter as the opposition parties figure out how they want to tackle these budgets?
The short answer is yes, I think it does. I think it will behoove the leaders of both the New Democratic Party and the Conservative Party to present positive visions that reflect those parties' ideas and values. And that will, I think, put pressure on the Trudeau government to be more ambitious. It's one thing to have the type of modesty we saw this week in a world where you're not facing real pressure of ideas. But as these parties have leaders and begin to develop their own programs, the government's going to have to step up its game.
Let me get 30 seconds from Angela and then the last word to JD.
I think that the Liberal government has strategically saved some of their ammunition for next year because they know they're going to be facing the full-fledged New Democrats and the leader with the Conservatives. They have consultations ongoing that we expect to be finished in the next 6 months. That gives them time to finish a whole whack of things that we don't have details on right now, but we'll have a much stronger and much more detailed budget next year, I think. And I think it's strategic on the Liberals' part to come out swinging in year 3.
Last 30 to you, John.
There's rarely been a government more futuristic in its outlook than the Trudeau crowd. This is a group of people who routinely refer to things like the Fourth Industrial Revolution, cascading technological change. That's actually the reality of day-to-day life for Canadians right now. It's what they're experiencing. The government's moves on innovation may be a little bit boring to Andrew Coyne, but they're actually pretty fascinating. If you read my friend Jean Lang's piece about what a revolution in industrial policy, the federal approach to machine learning and artificial intelligence
Where would
is,
we see that?
you would see it in, I think it was iPolitics.ca. You're really talking about a government that's trying to midwife change and help translate it into middle-class employment. A lot of people are threatened by the change. If this government can help be part of relating technological change to security and ongoing prosperity for Canadians, it's going to be the government for a long time. That's the core issue of our time. And the opposition parties aren't even talking about this.
To be continued. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us on TVO tonight. Angela McEwen, and let the record show, yes, she does spell her name with 2 L's. That was not a misprint, everybody. Angela McEwen in Ottawa from the CLC and the Broadbent Institute. Sean Speer, Macdonald Laurier Institute. John Duffy, Strategy Corp. Good to have all of you on TVO tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.